In a quiet town where every porch light glowed the same warm yellow and every Sunday morning bell rang without fail, a family secret was festering. On the surface, it was just a father and his son, living quietly in a weathered house at the edge of town. But behind those drawn curtains, behind walls that seemed to whisper when the wind pressed against them, something darker was unfolding. What began as loyalty and devotion twisted into something else entirely, a bond that blurred the lines between guidance and control, and love and possession. For years, their silence protected them. For years, the town ignored what it could not name. But secrets, no matter how carefully buried, have a way of clawing to the surface. And when this one did, it didn't just shatter a family. It left an entire community branded with shame, unable to look at itself the same way ever again. This isn't just a story about scandal. It's about how silence can turn love into a prison. Before we step into this chilling true story, take a second to support the channel. Hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next documentary. These aren't just stories. They're warnings about the hidden shadows around us. And trust me, you'll want to stick around until the very end of this one. The town was the kind of place people described as safe, ordinary, predictable. Maple trees lined the streets, and a single white steeple marked the horizon. Yet on the edge stood a house different. Its paint had long since peeled away, revealing gray wood scarred by seasons. The curtains rarely shifted, even on warm afternoons when neighbors opened windows. Children slowed their bicycles when passing, whispering ghost stories about what lingered inside. The house belonged to a father and his son. Outwardly, they seemed unremarkable. The father, quiet and stern, worked odd jobs around town. The son, tall yet withdrawn, trailed behind him like a shadow. They attended church, sat in the back pew, nodded politely to neighbors, and spoke little. Conversations with them never lasted long, ending with a distant smile or a curt nod. Nothing seemed openly wrong, but nothing felt right either. What unsettled people wasn't something they could name. It was in the way the son never strayed far, never spoke freely, never joined the other boys at the diner or on the baseball field after school. At first, the town excused it as shyness. "He's a good son," fathers said at barbershops, brushing off unease. "Devoted to his dad. Nothing wrong with that." But devotion can take darker shapes unseen. Inside the house, loyalty was more than routine. Meals were silent rituals. The father's gaze lingered on his son with an intensity that made words unnecessary. It wasn't encouragement, nor simple discipline. It was something heavier. The son had grown within that atmosphere. Friends never slept over. He didn't visit others after school. His father told him often, the world outside was cruel, dangerous, not to be trusted. Over years, those warnings hardened into belief. The boy stopped questioning. He stopped imagining life beyond his father's orbit. The world narrowed until only two figures remained, him and the man who controlled his every step. Neighbors sometimes saw them walking side by side, always together, never apart. The son's head bowed slightly, his eyes avoiding contact. To some, it looked like respect. To others, it looked like surrender. When the son reached his 20s, the silence became more noticeable. Boys his age were starting families, building futures. Yet he lingered in the same old house, sharing every moment with the man who raised him. Rumors trickled through the diner. "He's handsome, polite. Why hasn't he found someone yet?" Men lowered their voices as they said it. Nobody dared suggest the possibility everyone sensed but couldn't speak aloud. The house itself became a symbol of unease. At night, its lights glowed far later than seemed natural. Shadows moved behind the curtains, shapes indistinguishable, conversations muffled. Passers-by slowed their steps, but no one ever knocked. It wasn't fear that silenced the town. It was denial. People convinced themselves it was eccentricity, not danger. After all, Wasn't family loyalty a virtue? Who would question a father and his only son? But silence can be a dangerous kindness. Each year that passed, the bond inside those walls grew stranger. What outsiders mistook for care was in fact possession, and possession can twist devotion beyond recognition. The son began to sense it, though he couldn't name the feeling. When he looked at the other men his age, laughing freely, shaking hands, chasing dreams, something in his chest ached. Something felt stolen, and yet, when doubt surfaced, his father's words pressed down hard. The world doesn't understand us. Only I do. Only I ever will. The son stayed, not out of choice, but out of fear. By then, the house on the edge of town was no longer just a home. It had become a fortress, a stage where a performance of normality unfolded by day, while secrets thrived in silence at night. Everyone who passed sensed something hidden there, though none could prove it. The house whispered warnings through its peeling boards. The father guarded it fiercely, and the son, he was trapped, though he didn't yet know how completely. The father's presence filled every corner of the house. Even in silence, the air seemed shaped by his authority. He didn't need to raise his voice. Control radiated from every glance, every measured word. To outsiders, he was merely strict, a man hardened by work and solitude. But inside, his discipline stretched into obsession. He demanded order in everything, how meals were set, how footsteps echoed across wooden floors. The son lived within that rhythm. Every action, when to speak, when to sit, when to rise, was dictated by an unspoken code. Mistakes weren't punished with anger, but with heavy silence more suffocating than rage. That silence weighed on him. It carved doubt into his chest. Was loyalty strength, or was it a leash? He never dared ask. Questions were dangerous. Questions carried the risk of disappointing the only man he had. The father reminded him often of sacrifices made. "I kept you safe," he'd say, voice calm but final. "Others would have let you fall. Only I kept the world from taking you apart." Safety became the currency of control. The son was told friends couldn't be trusted. Neighbors would betray him, and strangers would use him. Gradually, isolation disguised as protection became the very fabric of his life. When other boys spoke of baseball games, romances, and weekend plans, he remained silent. He had no stories, no laughter to share. Instead, his evenings belonged to quiet meals, long talks, and the unyielding gaze of his father. The father's grip wasn't only in words, it was in gestures. A hand on his shoulder that lingered too long, a look that demanded attention, a closeness that blurred lines between guidance and possession. Outsiders saw only fragments. The way the son never strayed, the way the father's eyes followed him, sharp and possessive, as though guarding something no one else had a right to see. The son wanted freedom, but carried guilt like a chain. Whenever he thought of stepping away, of building his own path, his father's voice echoed, "After everything I've done, you'd abandon me," so he stayed. Nights stretched endlessly, conversations weaving into strange territory. What began as lessons shifted into rehearsals of loyalty, stories of devotion, declarations that their bond was sacred, stronger than anything the world could understand. The son didn't know where guidance ended and ownership began. He had grown inside the grip of a man who believed love was indistinguishable from control, and control was indistinguishable from survival. Sometimes when he stood by the window, he imagined life beyond the peeling paint and drawn curtains. He pictured laughter that wasn't rehearsed, companionship that wasn't forced. But those visions always dissolved beneath guilt, because his father was always watching, always reminding him that the world outside was filled with betrayal. "No one else will ever protect you," he said. "No one else will ever understand." The son nodded, though unease gnawed inside. He felt the leash, but mistook it for loyalty. He felt the walls, but called them home. In truth, he was trapped in a cage built from silence, and the father, convinced of his righteousness, believed the cage was safety. He believed devotion justified control, that his grip preserved something pure. He never saw it for what it was, possession masquerading as love. In that house, silence wasn't peace. It was a weapon. It bound the son to his father, shaping every thought, every fear. And outside, the town kept watching, sensing something wrong but refusing to speak. The town diner was the heartbeat of the community. Coffee cups clinked, forks scraped against plates, and stories passed freely. Yet slowly, conversations shifted. The father and son became subjects people spoke of in hushed tones. It began subtly. A man stirring sugar into his coffee leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Strange pair, aren't they? Always together, never see the boy with anyone else. Doesn't seem natural, not at his age." At first, others brushed it off. "He's just quiet," someone muttered. "Some boys don't chase crowds." But unease clung to the conversation, lingering like smoke long after the words faded. Seeds of doubt had been planted. Soon, the whispers spread beyond the diner. At the barber shop, men spoke while scissors snipped. At the church steps, greetings carried undertones of suspicion. Even casual remarks grew sharper, tinged with questions no one dared ask outright. One Sunday morning, the pews rustled as the pair entered. The father's hand brushed his son's shoulder. To most, it was nothing. But to watchful eyes, it felt too intimate, too deliberate, impossible to ignore. From that moment, glances followed them everywhere. The father seemed unbothered, shoulders squared, gaze steady. The son, however, felt the weight of eyes pressing down, whispers prickling his skin like cold wind against bare arms. In the diner, silence sometimes greeted their entrance. Conversations slowed, replaced by the awkward clink of silverware. The son avoided looking up, but he felt the judgment radiating from every table, every turned head. The father tightened his grip, speaking more fiercely of outsiders. "They envy us," he told his son. "They'll never understand what we have. That's why they whisper. It's jealousy, nothing more." But the son sensed otherwise. He felt the distance growing, neighbors pulling back, conversations cutting short. He heard the shift in tone when people greeted them, voices stiff, forced, like politeness stretched thin over suspicion. Even children noticed. Some pointed, snickering. Others asked their fathers why the boy never joined games or gatherings. The answers were vague, evasive. No one wanted to admit aloud what they were beginning to believe. The house itself fed the rumors. Curtains remained closed even in daylight. Late-night lamp glow cast silhouettes across drawn fabric, shapes moving too close, gestures lingering too long. Passers-by paused, unsettled, before hurrying on with unspoken dread. The diner became the crucible where suspicion hardened. Men leaned closer across booths, voices dropping. "I saw them at the market." He called him something strange. Almost slipped. Stories stacked atop one another, true or imagined. The son felt the tightening circle. Whispers followed him to the counter, to the church steps, to every corner of town. What had once been denial was becoming certainty, and certainty carried danger heavier than gossip. The father noticed too. He pulled his son closer, limited his steps beyond the house. Trips became shorter, conversations briefer, interactions rehearsed. To him, the whispers weren't warning signs. They were proof that the world was the enemy. But the son could not unhear them. He felt them cutting deeper each day, eroding the thin wall of secrecy they had built. With every sidelong glance, every muttered remark, his doubts grew sharper. Still, silence prevailed. No confrontation erupted. The town chose whispers over action, suspicion over truth. Yet in that silence, pressure built like steam in a sealed vessel, waiting for the inevitable moment when it would burst. For now, the diner carried the burden of suspicion. Over coffee and pie, men spoke in tones they pretended were casual. But beneath their words lay a truth no one wished to say aloud. Something was deeply wrong. And the son, trapped between his father's grip and the town's whispers, stood on the edge of collapse. The silence of his home was suffocating. The whispers outside were relentless. The walls of secrecy trembled. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, one that seemed no different from countless others. The son stood at the market counter, flustered and distracted, when his tongue betrayed him with a single word. He referred to his father not as Dad, but as my partner. The word hung heavy in the air, sharper than any shout, echoing in the startled silence of the man standing across from him. For a moment, no one spoke. The son's face stiffened, realizing what he had said. He tried to laugh, to cover it, to replace the word with something harmless. But the damage was done. In a town where gossip traveled faster than wind through trees, a slip of the tongue was enough to ignite flames. By nightfall, the story was already in kitchens, barbershops, and pews. He called him his partner. Men whispered over pie at the diner. Some scoffed, saying it was surely a mistake. Others nodded grimly, claiming they had always sensed something wasn't right. The son walked home with dread gnawing at his chest. He felt eyes burning into his back, imagined voices chasing him. Each step was heavier than the last, weighted by shame he couldn't shake. The father noticed the shift immediately. Conversations stopped when they entered rooms. Neighbors crossed the street rather than greet them. Smiles stiffened into frowns. A curtain of silence and judgment wrapped itself around their lives. Inside the house, the air grew taut with paranoia. The father insisted it was nothing but lies. "They twist everything," he muttered, pacing. "They'll never understand us, but we don't need their understanding." Yet the son knew the whispers were not lies. They were truth finally spoken aloud. What had been speculation was now certainty. He had confirmed it himself, with one careless word he could never erase. The town grew hostile. Strangers lingered near their yard, pointing. At the market, clerks refused eye contact. In the diner, conversations stopped cold when they entered, replaced by stares that pierced deeper than any words. The father's response was defiance. "Let them talk," he growled. "We know what we have. Their judgment means nothing." He clung to his conviction, convincing himself that their bond was proof of strength, not shame. The son, however, crumbled under the weight. His shoulders hunched, his gaze stayed fixed on the ground. Shame pressed against him like a storm, suffocating him with every whisper, every sidelong glance. Soon, the whispers reached officials. Anonymous calls arrived at local offices. Reports of unnatural behavior and suspicions too heavy to ignore flooded in. What the town once ignored was now under the cold light of scrutiny. Investigators arrived with sharp questions, flipping through records, examining forms. Financial documents blurred the lines between father and son. Papers bore signatures hinting at partnership rather than parenthood. Each detail fed into the growing storm. Photographs surfaced too. Images tucked away yet unearthed during inquiry. Moments too intimate, gestures too telling. To the town, they became undeniable proof. The secrecy that had once protected them now condemned them beyond redemption. The son broke first under interrogation. Years of silence cracked apart. Words spilled like confession, painting a picture of grooming, of control, of loyalty warped into dependence so absolute he couldn't see where it ended. The father, in contrast, remained unyielding. He spoke not of guilt, but of devotion. "It isn't a crime," he said with bitter pride. "It's love. They'll never understand. They're blinded by their ignorance." But ignorance wasn't the issue anymore. The truth had escaped, carried by one accidental word, and with it, the fragile walls of secrecy shattered, leaving father and son exposed before a town that would never forget. The courthouse filled with uneasy silence, every bench occupied by men who had once exchanged polite nods with the father and son. Now they leaned forward, eyes sharp, waiting to hear the unthinkable spoken aloud. The prosecution painted the father as a manipulator, a man who had twisted loyalty into dependence. They described years of isolation, grooming, and blurred boundaries. Every word pressed harder against the fragile mask the family once wore. The defense struggled. They argued the bond was unconventional but not criminal, claiming the son was a willing participant. Yet the son's testimony told another story, one of control disguised as devotion, trust disguised as possession. When the son took the stand, his voice trembled. He spoke of nights spent rehearsing loyalty, of friendships forbidden, of guilt used as a chain. His words carried the weight of a lifetime stolen. Men in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. Some lowered their eyes. Others clenched fists. What they heard was not scandalous romance, but a lifetime of manipulation, an existence where love had been weaponized into control. The father remained stone-faced, his expression unwavering. To him, the accusations were nothing but misunderstanding. "They twist the truth," he muttered to his lawyer. "They can't see what we share. They're blind to it." Outside the courthouse, the town seethed. Groups gathered on sidewalks, their voices filled with outrage. The house on the edge of town became a spectacle, strangers pointing, whispering curses, some daring each other to touch its fence. Inside, photographs were displayed as evidence. Images once hidden now projected for all to see, intimate moments, gestures unmistakable. Gasps rippled through the room. Even skeptics bowed their heads, unable to deny what their eyes revealed. The son spoke of guilt that bound him, of whispers that haunted him. "I didn't know where the line was," he said, voice breaking. "I thought loyalty meant surrender. I thought silence was survival." The father refused to yield. When called to testify, his voice carried conviction. "This isn't wrong," he declared. "It's stronger than their rules. The world fears what it doesn't understand. They'll never break us." But the town was already broken. Every word fueled outrage. Men shook their heads, muttering about shame, about betrayal of sacred boundaries. The courtroom became less a trial and more a mirror reflecting collective horror. Closing arguments echoed like hammer blows. The prosecutor's voice rang with finality, declaring the father guilty of grooming, manipulation, and betrayal. "This is not love," he said. "This is a prison built on silence." The verdict was inevitable. The father was sentenced, his name forever stained. The son, recognized as both victim and participant, was ordered into counseling, caught between shame and estrangement, torn by lingering loyalty to the man who ruined him. The town exhaled, but not with relief. Judgment was passed, yet the stain remained. Their community was now infamous, tied forever to a story of betrayal, manipulation, and silence that had festered too long. The house was vandalized. Windows shattered. Walls spray-painted with words like monster and curse. Teenagers dared each other to enter, treating it like a haunted ruin rather than the collapsed heart of a family. Reporters descended, cameras flashing. Headlines branded the town as the stage for one of America's darkest family scandals. Outsiders came not for its charm, but to point at the ruins of a life destroyed. The father sat behind bars, unrepentant. The son carried shame like a shadow, struggling to rebuild while burdened by scars too deep to heal quickly. And the town. It bore the weight of silence turned complicity. The trial ended with the gavel's strike, but its echoes lingered in every corner of the community. This wasn't just a verdict. It was a scar carved into the town's identity, one that would never fade. When the trial ended, silence fell heavy over the town. Yet it wasn't peace. It was the silence of shame, of a community marked forever by the scandal that had unfolded within its borders. The father was gone, swallowed by prison walls. Still, his presence lingered, his name whispered in disgust. Men at the diner avoided saying it outright, referring only to what happened or that cursed house. The son walked with his head bowed. Therapy offered tools, but healing was slow. Every conversation, every new acquaintance eventually circled back to the same shadow, the story that clung to his name relentlessly. He tried to move away, seeking work in distant places. But the past followed him. Employers searched his name, discovering headlines. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Relationships dissolved when whispers resurfaced, tearing open scars he thought concealed. The house itself became a monument of ruin. Windows shattered, boards rotted, weeds clawed at its foundation. Graffiti scrawled curses across its walls, branding it as a place of fear, a wound that refused to heal. Children pointed as they rode past, calling it haunted. Teenagers dared each other to enter, laughing nervously, yet always leaving unsettled. The house was no longer a home. It was a ghost, a reminder carved in wood. For the town, reputation was lost. Outsiders remembered not the steeple or maple-lined streets, but the grotesque tale that spread through newspapers and documentaries. The town's name became shorthand for scandal, a stain no time could wash away. Men who had once smiled politely at the pair now replayed memories with unease. Teachers remembered the son's silence, haunted by signs they had ignored. Neighbors asked themselves if their quiet nods had enabled something darker. The son carried that weight as much as his own. He bore not only his trauma but the unspoken blame of a town that had chosen whispers over confrontation. Silence had been his cage, and theirs. The father, even in prison, refused remorse. He insisted until his final breath that what they shared was misunderstood, that outsiders were blind. He died unrepentant, convinced the world had judged love as crime. The son lived on, never fully free. Every attempt to build a new identity collapsed under the weight of recognition. He was no longer simply a man. He was a story, a caution, a whispered warning. The town aged, but the memory didn't fade. Fathers recounted it to their sons as lessons about boundaries, secrecy, and silence. It became folklore, a dark thread woven into the fabric of community memory. The house decayed further, but it never disappeared from conversation. Parents told children to stay away. Boys dared each other to enter, claiming curses followed those who lingered too long. It became legend, etched into every generation's fear. Even decades later, when names had blurred, the story remained. Men gathered at barber shops and still muttered about it, shaking heads. The shame lived on, proof that some stains cannot be washed away with time. For the son, survival was his only goal. He drifted from town to town, never finding rest. Peace evaded him because the prison was no longer walls. It was memory, stitched into his identity. The tragedy was not only what happened, but how silence allowed it to grow. Isolation twisted loyalty into control. Whispers replaced action. A town looked away until the secret clawed itself into the open. And so the legacy remained. Not a story of love, but a warning. A reminder that silence can be as dangerous as cruelty, and that devotion, when warped, can become the most suffocating prison of all. The house still stands, its shell crumbling, its walls scarred with graffiti. It endures as a monument of ruin, a relic of betrayal and silence. For anyone who passes by, it whispers a single truth. Some shadows never leave.